what I'm doing with this project is that I advance a bifocal approach, which includes both normative and empirical research questions. That's the key thing that came out of the theory of contestation. And the lecture is organized in 5 parts to kind of demonstrate how this might work. I'll turn to the so-called Turbot War in fisheries between Canada and Europe in the mid-90s. So what I'm interested in, and here is where I will start with the introduction. The bifocal approach focuses on contestatory practices that work both within and through governance relations. So that's the way you imagine your agency. And this builds on norms, critical norms research in international relations theories and practice theory. That's pretty much the hype these days, practice theory. The name Christian Büger comes up a lot. And the innovative move, what I hope the bifocal research approach to norms and normativity can offer is to address normative questions that are derived from literature that theorizes normativity. That's something that normally in international relations we don't focus on, normativity. What's behind it? Where is it negotiated? So, and the larger book project will then seek to demonstrate how the value added of this interplay between normative and empirical research comes to the fore, and what you can actually do with it. And I do that with the reference to the conditions that qualify access to negotiation. So there's of course the normative question: who is allowed and able to participate in contestations? So it's not something that happens randomly, but something that is planned and strategically achieved at distinct levels of social order. And here I distinguish, and I go into this in a moment, between different levels of social order: micro, meso, and macro. Now, I argue that at each of these 3 levels, particular norms reflect the constitutional purpose and the social experience and the individual expectation of a plural set of global governance actors. And you already see I try to reflect the diversity that we need to bring in order to make norms not only understood and complied with, but to facilitate a legitimacy towards these norms of international law that many people have been taken for granted for a long time. Now, what I argue is that these actors are bestowed with agency through their role as citizens who engage in struggle about and within governance relations. And I take that straight out of James Tully's Public Philosophy in a New Key. Jim Tully has applied this concept to the Canadian sort of pluralist societal context, and I try to work that out for international relations. So empirically then, it follows that by studying citizens engaging with governance relations, it is possible to reconstruct the ways in which the normative structure of meaning and use is reenacted. And this draws on Jennifer Milliken's work. And again, you see a lot of IR will then sort of draw on the post-structuralists, on the French theorists, and another part of IR draws on sociological studies to norms, but what's in between? And that's the stuff that I'm interested in. And I found, for example, Jennifer Milliken's work on the, who refers on Derrida, obviously, the structures of meaning and use. If they are there, then we need to be able to demonstrate where and how they work. Now, this table, forget it, somehow it didn't make it into the, there's a few definitions, but we can forget about them now. Let me move on to the second part of the global governance and the legitimacy problem. I will I will give you a brief overview of global governance theories, just to kind of so that you get the hang of it, and you probably know these theories, and you will also know that global governance theories are relatively thinly theorized. It's more of a concept that something it's more, global governance theories are relatively elusive. So they commonly address issues of control and procedure that arise through the effects of globalization. Traditionally, these problems are addressed by refining regulatory mechanisms that enable monitoring trans-border processes in politics and policy making. I mean, that's the typical thing that you would answer in an exam, obviously, question. And then questions of power and regulation come up, and these normally then turn to the field of international law. How can we theorize regulation or political science, public administration? But then when we come to the point of trans-border politics and policy making, the shift of focus of political power or of agency is moving slightly towards international organizations. And that means that there is a loss of control on the part of the nation state. So the global settings involved are the United Nations, and especially the United Nations Security Council, and all sorts of international and regional organizations. Now, what we have is that if we look at what the international lawyers found out about that, is that with increasing trans-border activities, lawyers try to keep the lid on the increasingly complex set of procedures and modes of international interaction. So the point here is that international law, in order to bring peoples to the table and sign treaties, international law has to be relatively unspecific. Otherwise, you probably know the piece by Chase and Chase, 1993, an international organization where they say, in order to bring signatories to the table, international law has to remain relatively broad, and it requires interpretation afterwards. And that's the entire work that then draws on Harold Koh's observation that you needed processes of interpretation in order to understand the transnational workings of the law. Now, but at the time, and that's a view that many political scientists in international relations took over, is that still with Hankins finding in the 1970s that almost all the states comply almost all the time with almost all the norms in international law, but that's certainly not the case. And I come to that in a moment. But we have social constructivists jumping on that bandwagon and then say, oh, it's not only with legal norms that international actors comply, also with social norms, because they take them for granted, as Richard Price and other social constructivists then said. From this followed the literature on norm diffusion. You'll see that with Risse and Bürzel and many others. But they worked with the assumption that social norms were to be implemented across borders, and that if there was some discussion, you could use blaming and shaming and then overcome opposition to the norms. So this literature wasn't particularly bothered with contestation or contested compliance, as I had pointed out through the Iraq War discussion. You didn't have much compliance at the time. It was much more about contested compliance with international law. Now, and from that, I apologize for the very rough summary here, but the point I want to make is that as the experience of political unrest, institutional malfunction, prolonged financial crisis, and economic decline have demonstrated, norm transfer from one social context to another is more complex than assumed by most of the norm diffusion literature. And I want to cut right into that process, because norm transfer does neither begin nor end with norm implementation. Instead, treaty norms or constitutional norms, increasingly, if you look at the global constitutionalism literature, reflect normative authority that predates any treaty. Now, this paper, therefore, understands the trajectory of norm transfer as a highly complex and interactive process. And this is where the communication that Markus mentioned at the beginning comes in. And it's conditioned by, and that's another important aspect that I try to work out in that book, it's conditioned by cultural diversity, not just political organization. It's conditioned by cultural diversity and political and legal pluralism. But the aspect of cultural diversity and how that sort of cuts into international relations, that is something that I want to capture with this bifocal approach. It follows, sort of this point on diversity and pluralism follows that instead of basing theoretical assumptions on a core of shared fundamental norms, global governance research would benefit from working with the assumption of encountering distinct, diverse, and conflicting normative values that bear cultural contingencies, so as to preempt and handle normative conflict. And it is held that while the mismatch of these contingencies coming from different places is well accounted for by norms research that identify the legitimacy gap in global governance. And you'll find the legitimacy gap that originated through Steve Bernstein's and a lot of the environmental governance literature, where they kind of said we have the sort of the meta-norm of sustainability, but when it comes down to implementing standards, be it fishing quotas or be it emission standards, then most people are not that happy with the sustainability norm anymore. So we've got the gap between the macro and the micro. And so the hypothesis that then follows for contestatory practices is that if it is true that, as public philosophers and normative theorists hold, that contestatory practices have a legitimating impact, then it is worthwhile for global governance theory to incorporate this normative insight. So that's kind of the normative project that I try to pursue. And that's kind of the move that I'm currently working on, and I'm trying to figure out whether it works, is that rather than working with global governance theories that focus on political order, and therefore are interested in sort of directions of authority and movements of political power, I look at social order. And the moment you start focusing on social order and global governance, you are able to bring in the literature. You think Nick Onoff, the social construction of the global, and then you can think about different levels of social order where normativity is negotiated. So then the point becomes not one of whose political order, whose norms are actually followed and whose authority is lost, but who has access to contestation of normativity at these various levels. And for that, I bring in James Tully's public philosophy in a new key. And let me now do something which I actually kind of I move into the field, and I want to show you how this might work when we look at the Turbot War, to give you a kind of a site of critical encounter that actually happened, and where you have various parties who kind of argued past each other. And we're looking at this. I don't know who has been fishing before in the audience. Who knows something about fishing? You know where because if you look at the Grand Banks, and that's kind of the economic exclusionary zone in Canada, and you see Canadian jurisdiction sort of is only to the left-hand side of the red line, but the fish will most likely be found on the right-hand side, which means, because then there you have sort of stark abysses in the sort of differences in height, and you will have the fish sitting on the lower end on the ground normally. So now think about the Canadians in a situation where fish stock extinction is near, and they want to regulate fishing. What do? They establish a zero quota. But that will only affect the Canadians who are fishing on that kind of left-hand side of that picture. And you will have all sorts of international fishing folks catching their stock right on the other side. And this is the scenario that you had in 1995 when the Spaniards came and legally, according to international law, were fishing. And the Canadians came along and said, look, guys, I mean, we are working here we have a zero quota, and our sort of livelihood is threatened. And by fishing the fish stock that's just breeding on the other side, you're kind of threatening our livelihood. And so there you had a situation on the high seas where, imagine for yourselves, you're on the high seas. What do? Do you call Ottawa? Or do you call Madrid? Do you call Brussels? Where do you go in order to kind of get this solved? And what happened in the case was that actually the Canadians, I just sort of compress this, that was an ongoing incident, but in the end the Canadians used their guns. They used their guns, and even the Canadian Coast Guard was involved, not just the fishing, the trawlers, and they captured a Galician vessel, the Estay, and sort of brought the Spanish boat ashore in Canada. Now this was this incident happened on the 9th of March, on 16th April in 1995. And I will give you a brief account of what happened here with reference to international law and on the one hand, and with reference to the norms that guided people's behavior on the other. You had in Canada, you had a zero quota. The Canadians had a collapse of their cod fishery, of their Greenland halibut, which is also called Greenland turbot, and therefore we've got the name of the Turbot War. And so for the Canadians, as I said, it was prohibited to fish within the 200 nautical mile economic exclusive zone on the Canadian Atlantic coast. This resulted in 50,000 unemployed people in the Canadian fisheries industry. They were compensated to a certain extent, but there was no kind of structural adjustment program where they were relocated to work in other jobs. So the Canadians then saw the legitimacy of a zero quota with reference to the macro level, the meta norm of sustainable fisheries. Now, on the micro level, of course, for every individual fishing person, this meant you couldn't go out to fish anymore. Let me see whether I wanted to. Oh, unfortunately, these tables have been the transfer from one laptop to another didn't work too well. It's supposed to. This table is supposed to. I just wanted to give you the reference. On the left hand column, you should see fundamental norms on the macro level, then organizing principles on the meso level, and standardized procedures on the bottom. And which norms came into play here in this incident? You have for fisheries governance, maybe you can't see. You've got the macro norm, like which the social constructivists would say, the taken for grantedness. That was about sustainable fisheries. Everybody thinks that's a good thing, so it's relatively, it's not particularly highly contested. And then you have, on the meso level, you have precautionary principles and all sorts of negotiated principles. And on the micro level, you've got quotas, mesh size for fish nets, and so on and so forth. But then, now note that the Canadians also used guns. So under international law, what did they do? I mean, they were in breach with the norm of sovereignty. They were in breach with the norm of non-intervention, because they, by shooting a gun at a vessel from another country, you obviously intervene in that country's territorial space. And they didn't comply with Article 103 of the United Nations Charter, which establishes the regulation of non-intervention. Now, what's important here when I talk about these norms is that you have a different type of moral reach, as you see in the right-hand column. The fundamental norms sort of have a very broad normative and ethical reach. So it's important that people agree with it. But they are also in principle, when it comes to their implementation, that can bring about all sorts of contestations, which are not addressed at the treaty stage. That's the important thing. On the medium level, on the meso level, you see kind of a medium reach of moral and ethical principles. And when it comes to the standardized procedures, it's just straightforward implementation of regulations. Now, the Spaniards, of course, protested against this attack. And they said, look, we were doing everything that was illegal under international law. But here's a second aspect where the meso level comes in, and the organizing principles. And then I come to the point which is the key of this bifocal approach. Good. There is a Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, NAFO, which did regulate particular mesh sizes and certain, so that, the smaller the mesh size of the net, the more bycatch you will get, and the smaller the fish that you get, and the higher sort of the threat towards extinction of the fisheries. Now, the Canadians thought that they had a legal reference with this reference to the mesh size, but the NAFO is outside international law, and so far as it has only a regulatory function that is voluntary, that is based on a voluntary sort of agreement of the fishing folk to actually follow these regulations. So again, the Spaniards were right and the Canadians were wrong. I mean, I cut this long story short, and I get to my theory again in a moment. But what I want you to understand here is that for the Canadians, this was all about legitimacy. They felt from their own sort of their cultural validation, their own individual experience of having to suffer from the quotas and of trying to save the fish stock by actually abiding with the Canadian law, which doesn't apply for internationals. So they felt they had a legitimate reason to contest the practices of the Spaniards, whereas the Spaniards were referring strictly to legality. So they were within the law in every step that they encountered. But morally, they could be contested. And there's literature on this. Let me see where we go. Yeah. Now let me move to the three figures that I want to introduce as to how I suggest looking at that. And one is the cycle of contestation. Now, what you see on the first line is you see three stages of norm implementation. The first is kind of the constituting stage, where you will find that's where treaties are made. The second is the referring stage. It's much underused. That's where ownership can develop of norms, and I come to that in a moment. And the third is the to the far right, is the implementing stage of a norm. And these are kind of the concepts that the constructivist literature on norms works with. And I was interested in, rather than having a one-dimensional approach, how, if we distinguish amongst the group the context in which this practice is actually carried out, then you distinguish amongst a community context on the left-hand side, the social group, and the context of the individual person, sort of the individual environment. And I mean, this is what I'm trying to tell you here is kind of that reflects the entire book that is lying to my left. But the importance of this figure is that at each stage of norm negotiation, 3 possible actions can be listed. One is social recognition. That's something that as part of a social group, you act habitually, you will comply with norms. The second is formal validity. It's something you abide by the law. It's something that's written down in constitutional treaties. And obviously those who wrote the treaties will most likely be compliant with it. And the third is cultural validation. I call the individual the individual reference to one's own experience and the expectation towards a norm that follows. That's what I call cultural validation. So it's nothing to do with sort of homogeneous national cultures or something. The point I'm making here is that any agency who has access to all the 3 stages of recognition, formal validity, and cultural validation will consider a norm as fully legitimate. The moment that you're missing one position on the cycle, you will begin to doubt, and you will begin to raise questions. And now I'm coming to the next figure. Let me first say, just summarize the hypothesis, where I'm saying that actors who implement norms in international relations are no normative dupes. People have an idea of what they expect from norms. So if norm implementation is understood as an interactive process of reenacting normative structure of meaning and use, it follows that norm implementation is not carried out by normative dupes. And if that's not the case, then we need to actually look at these communicative processes and see what people advance in terms of their expectation towards a norm. This one we skip because, that's too bad. My tables used to look better on another laptop. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened here. But now here's the normative impact. The other figure I derived from empirical research, sort of in the field of norms research. Now we're looking at the normative model, and you will recognize on the top row the 3 stages of norm implementation: constituting, referring, and implementing. And I now sort of matched that with the potential agency at that particular level. So you have the masters of a treaty, you have the potential owners of a treaty, and you have the third at the implementing stage, the followers. The point that I want to make here is that the masters of the treaty are most likely to have access to all the 3 positions on the cycle, so they will consider the treaty as legitimate. At the implementing stage, on the lower quadrant on the right hand, in turn, people will most likely just have access to cultural validation. They bring in their own ideas, their own expectations, and so therefore they are the least sort of likely to be happy with having to comply with a norm. And the crux of this entire thing is that the optimal position for achieving legitimacy is that one in the middle, where people are able to develop ownership through access to regular contestation, which would be in the Turbot War situation, had the Canadians and the kind of the Canadian fishing associations communicated with European fishing associations about the NAFO regulations, which only the Canadians followed and not the Spaniard, then maybe a sense of ownership would have led them to respect the norm. And this is kind of the puzzle with which I almost close. The moment you construct an overlay between the empirical outcome of the cycle and the normative figure of the masters, owners, and users, what you see here is that the field in the middle is a field that cannot be reached by the theories that we have. And so the place where ownership could develop needs to be approached. And that's kind of the challenge that I see in future research. And I try to do that with, and I can show you this book project. This is kind of, I leave it there where I also spare you my final hypothesis. But that's what I want to do. And I thank you for actually inviting me, because it got me to push my thoughts a little bit into that direction.
Antje, thanks a lot. So you see, that's a little more complicated than norm behavior, right? And I'm sure you have a few questions here or there. Who wants to go first?
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Turbot. I'm from the Netherlands, and actually I wanted to ask two questions. The first one was just for clarification, and the third one was the second one, no third one yet. The second one was more about like building on from what you've said. So the first question was about where you introduced the cycle of norm creation. You had an arrow there. So to me that seems to suggest that there's like some kind of, not necessarily progress, but a process, a temporal component that you go from one thing to the other, to the other, to the other. So I was wondering, could you elaborate a bit more on why it's there? Because just now I didn't really understand why the arrow is there. I got like the parts of different people having different functions that create formal validity and the cultural validity. Just an arrow. Where is it coming from? And the second one was I was thinking like where you stand on the more philosophical discussion of universality versus relativism, because you were talking about how there are certain norms. So, for example, sustainability that basically everybody can agree on. Everybody will say sustainability is good, but then when it comes down to practice, people have a different understanding. And I was thinking, could you not also make the same case for in this debate of universality versus relativism, that basically there are universal norms that people can agree on, like you shouldn't kill people without a reason, but then the implication on the individual level, or perhaps the group level, then differs, because some people will say, well, one reason could be that he slept with my sister, and another group of people say that's not a reason. So could that be a way perhaps to also bridge the gap between relativism and universality?
Mm-hmm. Shall I answer directly, or do you want to?
Are there lots of questions? Yeah, let's do a bundle of three.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really liked that you make research on the interaction of international relations and international law, which is quite rare. I wanted to ask you about this dispute between countries. What do you think was the motivation of Canada? Because the resource they were fighting for was not a scarce one, and usually when we say about such environmental disputes, they take place between developing countries over such important resources as fresh water, petroleum. So what was the reason why this dispute appeared? And the second reason, you mentioned that there was an international treaty covering the relations on fishing. Why do you think the treaty and the organization which was created in accordance with that treaty was a weak one? I found an information about the fact that the quota system was not perfect, that the inspections were not good, and also the problems with scientific data.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Why was the system weak, and what were the weak sides?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. One more in the first round. Yes, Sarko.
So my question for you is, having gone through this cycle and actually discussing the different actors involved, I also want to ask you, how do you define access, and how do you define who gains access to the contestation?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's incredibly important as well to define. And how do you tackle that, actually?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Antje.
Great, very good questions. On the arrow of the what's not really a circle. It's not supposed to be a circle. The arrow. I really need somebody to help me with my PowerPoints, because the thing is like really something that we have. I had as a child when I was learning. My grandfather made that a clock where I could actually move the dial. What is it called? The diameter. And you could just move it around, and then he would move it around and say, what's the time now? And I had to, and that was the way I learned the clock. I'm a bit older than you, so that we didn't have any gadgetry internet or something. The point here is, of course, the arrow means that these positions are not fixed. The positions can sit, social recognition can sit at the referring point, but it can also sit on the constituting point, and the same accounts for each of the positions on the cycle. And that's just to demonstrate. That was my best way of demonstrating the flexibility of the position. But if you look at it, and you only understand it once you do this overlay with the normative table, that the masters are the ones who are most likely to be able to actually bring each of the cycle positions to bear. And once you actually grasp that, then if you look at the distinction between the masters and the users, it's just, in my view, much more obvious that at the meso level, a gap is there which doesn't need to be bridged, but which needs to be filled. So that's just to demonstrate movement. And the second point, that's also a very good question, because I could obviously, there has been some people follow Mouffe and Laclau, and then they go into the agnostic. I don't do that, and Jim Tully doesn't do it either. So there is a reference to the universal, but there is also a possibility for a multiverse. And Jim Tully makes an argument for the multiverse of constitutional norms. And this allows us to walk into the field and do interviews and see what people's respective universal norms are in various contexts. Because in that sense, of course, I do take a position that assumes quite a strong European ethnocentric, a Eurocentric approach to what's universal. And in my view, and I've just written a paper on the moral leadership of the United Nations, which stands contested. We are always taught in our classes in international relations that the norms that are written into the United Nations Charter are universal and all the rest of it. And that is something where I think we need to, and a lot of this literature, we need to rethink. Not by saying there's no norms that are valid, quite to the contrary, because norms are strong movers. Norms move people's actions. And so we will gain from empirically establishing what kind of universal norms exist in the various contexts. And we, if you even look at the brief history of the responsibility to protect, that's another story in my book, kind of the narrative. And if you look at the way how the West talks about the responsibility to protect, and you have the BRICS talking about responsibility while protecting, it's a different story. It's different universals that come into play. Okay, that's just very brief. Then on the motivation for the zero quota, well, in Canada, fish is a very important resource. Atlantic fisheries, you had thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people depending on that fish stock. And if with that fish stock coming close to extinction, that fish sort of the cod and then the turbot was actually threatened. And so in that sense, the motivation for the zero quota was there, survival. Very simple. And you see that now in the Mediterranean, of course, with the Japanese and the tuna fishing and the contestations where kind of the Spaniards are engaging with deals so that they can continue with their almadraba cultural practices, whereas the Japanese come in. And again, on this side, in Spain, you've got the Guardia Civil, the Spanish police, playing the game along with this entire negotiated set, which is entirely illegal. So they let the Japanese sort of take the tuna out of the Mediterranean before it gets to the grounds where they would actually settle to breed, because the Japanese prefer the hembras, what's that? The female fish, to eat them whilst they're sort of pregnant. So yes, it is a contested, and then access to contestation. Yes, that is taken out of normative theory, and I'm looking at that's again part of this book where I have distinguished contestation as the process that we can sort of recapture, and contestedness as a meta principle at the meso level of global governance, where we operate with the assumption that every norm is always contested because of the diversity of actorship in international relations. So this is kind of 180 degrees different from what the social constructivists will say, where they try to push on to diffuse norms, where I would say, well, hey, if you actually look at what's out there, and if you apply philosophy, and then you can work with the expectation that norms will be contested. And then, of course, people can move away and say, oh, it's just about interests. But then you are back in a Hobbesian world, which most of the constructivists claim they don't want. And so then in order to crack that, we need to figure out who are the legitimate stakeholders in a particular sector of governance. The best approach yet that I've seen in that area is Philippe Schmidter's kind of voucher democracy. I'm not sure whether you've come across that, where people who work in a particular sector will be able to kind of vote in that particular sector. And you can apply that to global governance, where people have a potential or a principally established access to regular contestation in the field that matters most to them. That's the idea.
Second round question. If you are very much afraid about the theory, you can ask about fish as well.
There's no need to be afraid of theory.
No, there's really no need.
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the main problems of states comply with international law from the IA point of view? What prevents them to comply with their obligations when they sign the treaty and then they comply?
Anything else? Then we can do the last round. And that's the last round. That's it? Come on. Friday night, okay.
Well, I think for Friday
there's one more. There's one more. For Friday, it's okay.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm from Austria. I have a very general question. It would be about to know whether you think there is a link to nationality, if some nationalities are more communicative, and if for that reason the outcomes of certain treaties are different. Or if this could explain certain outcomes as well. So have a geographical
yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it is a Friday night, and but that's a very good point. You know, I'm not sure whether you have heard of Amrita Nalika's work on India, for example. She's the new president of the German Institute for Global Area Studies in Hamburg, and she used to run the Center for International sort of Emerging Powers at Cambridge. And And she has done research on how negotiations go, for example, exactly taking into account the point that some nations expect their leaders to be involved in discussions for a certain amount of time. And she said that when Indian delegations return from a conference after 2 or 3 days, they will be unable to communicate their achievement of that conference as legitimate to the Indians. Because then the parliament, the parties, the interest groups will say, well, obviously, the other negotiators didn't take you seriously. They didn't hear you out. Otherwise, they would have dedicated more time listening to you and talking to you. And so you have precisely the point that the time, the amount of negotiations does depend on national experience. I would probably break that down to the cultural validation aspect, where Indians know they walk into this, and if there's not sufficient discussion, then they don't even, they don't argue further. You have another way in terms of where in Europe the negotiations sort of prior to the Lisbon Treaty, you will have Germans participating in the negotiations. And the German delegation will have, let's say, 3 carefully elaborated points. They probably go on for hours, and probably, they vary, Habermasian, whatever. And then all 3 are completely, they're off the table. They don't gain support. The British come with 15. And usually they get like 5 perhaps or 6, and they come with a pluralist negotiating attitude, which is distinct. I mean, I'm not an expert on negotiations, but these are, I've looked kind of into these processes of contestation at various places. Okay, so yes, important. And then the state obligation, well, that really depends on the. You asked when, at which stage, when will states feel more or less obligated to follow a treaty. Part of it will be the question whether or not they had a say in the negotiations or whether they were made to comply. There's some good work in IR theory by, I think, Chris Roy-Smith and others, by Michael Byers, actually, who focused on the question of obligation for compliance for countries that were sort of were added as members, like in the European Union following enlargement. This entire work by Sedlmayr and Schimmelpfennig on enlargement, you can see that the states that joined the European Union last will feel that the entire normative network is sort of matters less to them than to those who have negotiated the norms on all the processes all along. There was a long discussion around the time of the Iraq War, which was before the enlargement took place, and where the the Central and Eastern European countries didn't have access to the discussion of constitutional reform. They could offer their opinion, but they were not taken their voices. They didn't have a voice in the negotiations, and that's kind of a good example where you say the principle of obligation to follow the treaty norms upon accession. That is not a very strong principle, and therefore you would, and that's been discussed and problematized in various of the international legal works. And you have a very nice a situation where legitimacy works against legality in terms of have people been involved. Yeah. That's probably where.
Antje, thanks a lot. Given your surname, please come and visit us more often. His name is Wiener. Huh?
Yeah.
Wiener. And then for the non-German speakers, maybe a big hint. Thanks a lot for your talk, and
Thank you very
thanks
much
a lot
for inviting
to
me.
you
Yeah.
for your questions.